Hello and welcome to this tutorial from Escape Studios. Today we are going to be learning how to recreate the effect of a ship breaching through the surface of water and crashing down, creating a big splash like you might see in the movie Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. So we're going to be doing this in Houdini, and you can see I really roughly animated a ship breaching and then splashing down. I'm not an animator, but this will do the job. And I've also animated a camera just to kind of give a bit more, a better perspective on what's going on. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be running through a really kind of basic flip simulation. And so we're going to be looking at generating the collision geometry for this ship, and also generating secondary simulation elements, foam and spray, to get the kind of best result we possibly can. So first of all, we need to look at just building the flip simulation. So if we look at our shelf and go over to our ocean tools, and then particle fluids, we're going to create a flip tank. So this is going to be the kind of source of our main flip simulation. So I'm just going to drop a flip tank in. This is going to create a couple of nodes at the object level. So we've got our fluid tank initial, fluid tank interior. For now we can turn off our fluid interior, we don't need that. And also obviously we've got our dot network, which has been created automatically, and this is where all the computations for solving the fluid are going to happen. So first of all, let's look at our fluid tank initial, and at the moment we can see that this is much too small. Just before I start resizing things, I'm going to hop into my dot network and change the particle separation on my flip tank to 3. And so particle separation is literally that. It's the distance between each particle, and obviously the higher value that is, the less particles you're going to have in your simulation. And so while we're setting things up, if we put this at a kind of higher value, we're going to get a much quicker feedback, just so that I can see the size of the flip tank. So let's hide the fluid for a second and hop into our fluid tank initial, and this is where we are going to set the size of our flip tank. So if I just make this a tiny bit bigger, so you can see here our particle separation is linked to our auto dot network, the value that we just set. The water level is exactly that, how high the water is. And so the first thing I'm going to do is just move this onto the grid. It just makes things easier for resizing, and you can use this with, well, any kind of primitive you create. I normally, whenever I create a box or a sphere, I'll just drop this expression in to move it up to the base of the grid. So ch channel size y, which is this value, just multiplied by a half. So now you can see it's the base of our tank is sitting on the grid. And now I want to make this slightly bigger, so let's say 250 by 150 by 250 again. Okay. Let's just... Okay, and now we need to increase the water level to actually start seeing our particles. So let's set this to maybe, just trying to see where my camera is. I might actually just change the color of my background to grey. Oh no, light. There you go. Just so I can see my camera. Okay, so let's put this at maybe 10 or 12, just so that our camera is kind of sitting on the water as if it's from the perspective of someone in the water looking up at the ship. Okay, so this is, I guess, the kind of size that we want for our flip tank. Obviously, when we play it through, because I haven't got my dot network or the fluid import visible, we're not seeing any motion in the particles. So let's look. There's our ship and our camera. Okay, perfect. So what we need to look at now is our fluid tank fluid. I'm going to run through some of these nodes. So from here we can see that our fluid tank is being imported, and this is a .io .import output node, and all this node is doing is it's bringing in data from our DOP simulation and to SOP context, and so we can see all our particles here. This fluid compress node is relatively new in Houdini, and the way that a flip simulation works is it's a combination between volume calculations and particles, and so when the fluid is calculated by volumes, and then once the density of that volume drops below a certain point, the simulation for that area turns into a particle simulation. And this can speed up, well, it has sped up kind of fluid simulations, because particles can take a very, very long time to simulate, and so it's kind of balancing between the two. And this fluid compress node essentially compresses the data that you might need to store. So it's only storing the necessary information for you to have to be able to render a good simulation. So there's actually a really good video, I think, side effects about fluid compression and kind of workflows, optimizing your flip simulations on their website. But anyway, so let's hop back up to object level and go into our DOP network. And so this is where in DOPS you have the flip tank, obviously the flip solver. This is where all the actual calculations for the simulation are going to happen. So this flip object, it's bringing in the initial data the values that we set previously. So from our fluid tank initial, it's bringing in the data, it's bringing in the particle field, and we have our particle separation here, particle radius scale and grid scale. So this is bringing in our kind of initial data, and then the solver is calculating, and it's going to calculate collisions, it's also going to calculate interactions with other particles, and this is where you can set your overall simulation information, parameters, sorry. And so we need to have this object, our boat, ship, collide with these particles. And if I played this through now, when the ship moves through the water, there's not going to be any interaction between it, because although this flip object is dynamic, we haven't yet made this ship a dynamic object. And so we need to tell Houdini that this ship needs to be included in the calculations as well. It's just going straight through. Because this object is animated, we don't need to... We want to give the positional information from the animation instead of actually having forces act upon this ship. So things like gravity and other forces you can add, because obviously gravity is affecting our fluid, but this has already been animated. So we just want the ship to affect other objects. So instead of making this a kind of dynamic object, we're going to make it a static object. And now if we hop back into our ship, we can see this has been created, dot path, and it's a string which is looking at or referencing our dot network. One thing I always like to do is just drop in null nodes to give a bit of organization. Let's call this out dops. Okay, so if we go back into our dot network, you'll see that hit L to layout, the ship has been brought in. This is what was being referenced in that attribute create, this node, and it's also brought in a static solver. Again, if we were to press play, you wouldn't get a collision here, because at the moment this node is referencing our ship geometry only on the first frame. And so we need to tell Houdini that we don't just want to reference the position of this on the first frame, we want to reference it every frame. It's deforming, it's animated. So we check use deforming geometry. So now if I do a quick flipbook, I'm just going to actually change the particle separation to 2 just to give us a better interaction. And I'm just going to do a quick flipbook so that we can see the kind of first run at our collision. So I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to run a flipbook. Okay, so flipbook's been created. So if I press play, you can see we're starting to get collisions now, but we're not getting very good interaction between the particles themselves and the geometry. You can see particles are actually kind of going straight through the geometry, and this is down to the how our geometry is being created in DOPS, so how it's being kind of interpreted to collide with the particles. So if we go over to our ship, and I'm going to turn off display geometry for a moment because I just want to look at the collision geometry that is being created for our ship at the moment. So the kind of base collision geometry that Houdini will create. I'm just going to create a new camera so that I can redo flipbooks from the same perspective. Okay, so back into our dot network and just turn off display geometry. And now if I go to our collisions tab, you can see here this is where the collision geometry for our objects is created. So at the moment we're using the ray intersect mode and our RBD tab. we've got, and it's being divided 30 times. So if I turn on our collision guide here, you can see how our geometry is being interpreted. So it's being divided 30 times, and that's why we're actually, if I turn on display geometry again, we're not getting and wireframe, we're not getting a good kind of interpretation of our actual geometry. You can see here it's because it hasn't been divided enough. If I put this up to say 90, we're getting, it's better, but you can see these thinner areas of the geometry are still not really being resolved, and you know, for this to be really kind of high quality in these areas you're not getting at all, we would need to whack this uniform divisions up much higher, and it's just going to slow down our simulation. I mean, even at 120 we're still not getting these areas, the thinner areas. So we need to think of another way of generating collision geometry so that we can resolve these kind of thinner areas. And one way to do that is generate a collision volume for the ship. So let's hop into our, I'm just going to hide the fluid for a moment. Let's go into our ship geometry, and another thing I need to do, because we're calculating the velocity of the interaction between this geometry and the flip particles, if we look at our geometry spreadsheet and I press play, at the moment we have P attribute. For each point we have its position in space, so px, py, vz, but we're not calculating the velocity of these points, so the change between each frame. That's because this is not a dynamic object, it's object which has been animated. So Houdini, there's an easy way to do that in Houdini, and that's just to create a trail SOP. And I'm going to put that above my out dops. And the trail SOP will allow you to compute velocity of each point. So I'm just going to put the result type to compute velocity. And now you can see we've got Vx, Vy, Vz. And this is going to show the change in velocity. Sorry, the velocity based on each changing frame. So now, if I look at collisions again, so I hop back to my cam 1, I turn on my dot network, and I'll do another flipbook to see what difference this has made. Okay, so now if we look at our result with velocity being computed, you can see you get a lot more splash. The velocity from the ship is being added to the particles, and you're getting the water kind of being thrown up. So if we look at, say, move to there, if we compare to without velocity being computed, you can see you're getting more splash and more activity around the base of the ship than before. Okay, so we still, however, getting not getting the thin areas resolved on the ship. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a collision volume for the ship. So first of all, I'm going to drop a poly cap in, and all this is going to do is fill any holes in my geometry, and it makes it much quicker to compute, to calculate the volumes. So triangulate caps, let's have a look. turn that on. And okay, and now we are going to create a VDB from polygons. VDBs are really kind of quick to compute in terms of, well, in relation to other volumes, and if we look at our VDB polygons, you can see it's an estimation of the surface of the geometry. And if I didn't have my polycap node turned on, although you might not notice a big difference, sometimes you might have small holes and it's not actually going to resolve the shapes of your geometry as well. So we'll keep that turned on, and you can see when I turned it on there was some extra voxels being added around here. So anyway, we just want to, I'm going to turn off wireframe and hide other objects just so that I'm looking at this shape, just the VDB. And although we've got generally quite a good estimation, it's still not as good as I would want. Kind of these areas here, the railings, again these thin areas are not being resolved quite as well as I'd like. So what we're going to do is drop this voxel size down to maybe 0.08. See how that looks. Okay, it's better. It's still not quite as good as you'd want, but one way we can solve that is to increase the amount of our interior band voxels. Okay, so this is good enough, I think. Because the object's moving quite fast, you're not going to notice these kind of these areas not being as kind of high resolution as you might have hoped, because these take up a lot of memory, less than traditional volumes, but still quite a lot of memory. And so I want to write out this this volume sequence so that we can then source the volume in our DOP network. So I'm going to drop in a ROP output driver, render frame range, geo, I'm going to call it $hip, so the name of our Houdini file, geo, and I'm going to create another sub directory, again $OS, and $OS relates to, it just references the name of the node. So this I'm going to call ROP_collision VDB. And then I'm just going to save this to disk. So I'm going to pause the video, save it to disk, and then I'll come back when this has all been saved out. Okay, so that is all saved, and you can see I've brought it in here. I've just dropped in another file node and referenced the sequence of files we've just written out. And so now I'm going to drop in another null, and I'm going to call this out VDB. Okay, so now we've got our, I'm just going to set the display flag on this to the geometry. Now we have our collision geometry set up, and we can concentrate on the fluid Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to use that volume we've just created to by the static objects we have in our dot network to calculate collisions. So at the moment we're using our ray intersect mode, and all that's doing is it's dividing our geometry up 30 times or 120 times into to a kind of volume which is going to then collide with the fluid. But as we saw before, this value's got to be huge before you can resolve the thinner areas of the geometry, and that's just going to slow down our simulation. So instead of using ray intersect, we're going to use volume sample. And down here in our proxy volume channel, I'm just going to look at the ship geometry and the out VDB, and I'm going to export the relative path. And now let's just pump the uniform divisions up to about 90. Okay, so this is correct. It's looking at the VDB we just created. So now let's do a quick flipbook just to see how our shape's being resolved now, and see if we're getting a better collision with the fluid than before. So I'm just going to pause now and generate this flipbook. Okay, so what I did is I actually turned off the particle visibility on the flip tank, and I turned on the collision guide, just so that we can see how the shape is being represented, and you can start to see these thinner areas colliding with the particles. It's still not very good because we haven't actually looked at our flip solver settings yet, and also because the particle separation might not be low enough to get good collisions with thinner areas, and these thin areas might just be kind of passing through the space between the particles. So let's now, we have our collision geometry set up. Stop that. Go back to the first frame. Now we want to look at the settings for our flip simulation. So if we look at our flip tank, we can see a particle separation there. This is where I turned off the visibility of the particles and turned on the visibility of collisions. And there's other guides, I'm not going to go through all of them, but they can help to kind of debug what's going on in your simulation. So these guides, these tabs relate to the corresponding guides. At the moment we have a visualization on the particles. If I have a look, we have a visualization of the speed of the particles from this blue to white. And so as you can see, areas which are colliding with our ship are turning from well, it's ramped between these values. Okay, so if we look in the physical properties of our flip tank, bounce forward, friction, dynamic friction, temperature, density, I'm going to leave them as is, but the viscosity I'm going to add a very small amount. And so this is just going to help to give a tiny bit more stickiness to the water, not enough to kind of be noticeable. Obviously a very high amount would turn the liquid into something like honey, but this is just going to add a very subtle amount of viscosity to the fluid, so that it's not kind of behaving like a complete gas. Okay, and we can leave everything else. Now, this is not the only place you have to turn on viscosity. You also have to turn it on in our flip solver. But I'm going to look through each of the different parameters we have here. So, timescale, leave that at 1 just to be kind of physically accurate. Now we have our minimum substeps and maximum substeps. and obviously this is the amount of how many times per frame calculations being performed. So I am just going to boost that to 2 and the max to 3. This CFL condition, basically what it is kind of how likely, the lower this value is, how likely it is that the maximum substeps are going to be used. So if we look at the tooltip, it says factor used to automatically determine what size substep the scene requires. So the lower this is, the more likely that this value is going to be, or more towards this value is going to be used. So I'm just going to drop that down to 0.9. I'm going to leave the particle advection CFL as is. So now let's look at our particle motion. And as I said at the start, a flip simulation, fluid implicit particle stands for, is a combination between particle simulation and volume simulation. So we can control how our particles behave in the simulation and also how the volumes behave. So at the moment, before we had, you could see the particles were going straight through the geometry, partially because our collision geometry wasn't kind of high enough resolution to resolve the thin areas, but also because upon collision we weren't actually doing anything with the particles. So I'm going to set this to move outside collision. So this is saying now, because we have our VDB, our volume, we're using the calculation of whether the particle is inside the volume or outside each voxel, and it's going to try and move that particle outside of the voxel if it detects that it's inside the volume. And also I'm just going to click kill unmovable particles. And so behavior, we don't need an ID or age attribute. And also I'm going to turn off reseeding, and what reseeding does is it attempts to kind of add more particles as particles are killed or move outside the bounds of the flip tank, so that it keeps the kind of same amount of particles overall. So as particles die, it will try and add them in, but sometimes this can mean you get popping as new particles are created. So I'm just going to leave that off. I'm also going to leave separation off. I'm going to turn on droplets, and basically what droplets are is when the when the volume drops below a certain density, obviously it turns into a particle simulation, but the particles can still tend to kind of clump together. And so what droplets are, they give a bit more of a kind of spray effect. So once the particles have dropped below a certain kind of density, then we're going to tell them to turn into droplets, which will then behave more like droplets, more like kind of spray. And so I'm going to turn the minimum density, and so this is the minimum density of the particles before which they're turned into a droplet. And I'm going to leave the maximum at 1. And now we're going to leave the behavior to blend with fluid, and all that means is that when it rejoins the fluid, it's just going to be blended, or we could have it killed when they turn into a droplet, or killed when they blend back in with the fluid. But so we're just going to leave it with blend, and we're going to leave the velocity blend to 0.2. Okay, so the next tab is vorticity, and this is basically the kind of chaos of the particles, and this can be used to calculate white water. The more kind of swirly an area is, then the higher this attribute is going to be. So we'll add vorticity, but we'll leave these parameters as they are. And I'm not going to add a rest attribute, we don't need it. So now let's look at our volume tab, volume motion tab. So at the moment we have our velocity transfer, splashy kernel. These are literally, they do what they say. If you want a kind of splashy simulation, you use this kernel. If you want the more swirly one, you use that. I'll just leave it on splashy. The force scale we're going to leave to 1, and the velocity smoothing to 0.1 at the defaults. Okay, so these this velocity scale, obviously if you want bigger splashes you can increase this value, but you need to be a bit careful because the higher it is, the more unrealistic it might look. So we're just going to leave this at 1 because we're calculating our velocity on the geometry, and we are going to turn on stick on collision because we want the particles to stick to the hull of the ship as it breaches out of the water. So it's going to attempt to kind of match the particle to the face within the face of the geometry within a certain distance, this max distance. And this is kind of gives you a bit more artistic control over the look of the water. I'm going to turn the normal scale, and this is just kind of how much the particle is going to try and match the normal of the face that it's sticking to. Okay, so before I mentioned that we not only needed to have our viscosity turned on in the flip tank, but also in the flip solver. So I'm going to turn that on here. So now we should have a viscosity attribute here, you can see, and it's a scalar value. So density we don't need, divergence and this solver we can leave as they are. I'll just talk about the solver quickly. Feedback scale, this is quite important when you have things interacting within the scene, because certain things are bidirectional within Houdini. Say you wanted the velocity of the fluid to affect a rigid body object, you can adjust this feedback scale. So the higher this value, then the more influence the fluid is going to have on other dynamic objects in the scene. And you can also use OpenCL to speed up your simulation, which is good, but when you first turn it on, obviously every time first frame it's going to have to load everything onto your GPU, so it at first can slow things down. But it's good in certain circumstances. So now let's have a look at how our simulation is looking. So I'm just going to pause the video and I'm going to do a quick flipbook. Okay, so you can see this is the flipbook I've just generated. You're getting much better collisions, and those particles that are not moving outside the collision are just being killed. And you're getting this kind of sticking to the surface, which is nice. And you can play with those settings till you get the kind of look that you want. This is good for me for now. So I'll just stop this. And you can see there you've got pretty good collision. So now, once you're happy with how your simulation's looking, the next stage would be to cache the simulation out. And so this is where our fluid tank fluid network comes into play. We have our fluid compress node here, and you have different parameters for how you are going to compress the data. I'm not going to go through all of them. There's, as I said earlier, there's a really good video on the by Side Effects about flip workflows. But anyway, we'll look at the particle fluid surface node. All this is doing is generating a surface from our compressed cache, but we actually want to write out the data from our compressed cache here, so that we can then use those volumes, because if we look, you have the volumes and the particles. We want to use those to calculate our white water. So I'm going to drop in a ROP output driver. I'm going to rename this ROP underscore flip base, and then again hit $hip geo, and then $os, and then /. And I want to render the frame range. So now let's save this to disk and come back when this is all saved. Okay, so the flip simulation has been written out. I've dropped in a geometry node at the object level, and then I've just referenced the compressed cache that we wrote out. And what I'm going to do, at the moment you can see that we have just volumes, and so we want to drop in a particle fluid surface node so that we can read the data from the compressed cache and output particles, so we can see the simulation. So if we click on our fluid surface, and I'm going to turn this from surface polygon soup into just particles, and there you can see now we've got our particles back. It doesn't look the same because we're not actually visualizing the velocity. Before we were visualizing speed, so you just need to set the ramp visualization to be to velocity. Okay, so this node, you can look at different things like particle fluid, compressed fluid, and all that's going to do is fill in the gaps between each particle, and so it gives it more of a kind of full appearance. And now, but I just want the particles, because we're going to create a surface from this now. So we've got just under 3 million points, and obviously on the first frame, before any compressions happened, because the fluid is getting compressed, we're losing some of that, some of the particles underneath the surface, because we just don't need them. Once this has been meshed, you don't need to see the particles which are kind of below that level anyway. So we want to create a surface from this, and we're going to use VDBs again. So firstly, create VDB from particle fluid, and turn that 0.35. And now this might take a while to compute. So if we look at this, you can now see from our particles we have VDBs. And so from this, we are going to convert the VDBs to polygons. So we're going to drop in a convert VDB node, and we want to select polygons. So now if we look at the wireframe, you can see we've got polygons instead of just VDBs. We get these kind of artifacts here, and that's because obviously the surface is being created from individual points, and so we can just drop a VDB smooth to try and even out some of these artifacts, and that looks a lot better. So that's without the smoothing, and this is with. Okay, so now we are going to look at how you could do a whitewater setup. So ideally you would write out this this sequence. So you would write out your flip mesh to disk, and then you would use the volumes from your initial flip simulation to calculate the whitewater. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. First thing we need to do for whitewater is to just select a whitewater node, the whitewater shelf tool, and it's going to say select fluid for generating whitewater. So if we hop back into our DOP network, I'm going to click flip tank and hover over the viewport and press enter. And now this is going to create a few nodes up at the object level. Whitewater import, similar to how our flip tank was created. We'll import, sim, and source. So at the moment our whitewater source is referencing the fluid in our DOP network. We don't want to do that. We want to reference the compressed cache we've written out. So if we look for our file, this is the compressed cache in our flip base. And so now instead of referencing the DOP network, it's just going to reference it from disk. And so from here you can control the whitewater generation based on the attributes of the initial base flip simulation. So we have our whitewater source here, and this is going to control basically, because essentially the whitewater is just a particle simulation. And then it's being written out there, and if we volumes out, just outputs the volumes that are being merged in from our cache. So let's go back up to the object level and look at the other two nodes that have been created. So we have our sim and our import. Import again is just does a couple of post processes. So this is where we can affect the whitewater solver. Notice that it's a different DOP network to the flip simulation. So we have our object here, our emitter, which is just referencing the source, and then the solver, and this is where we would write out our simulation from. So if we look at our whitewater solver, you can see we have foam, spray, and bubbles, and then the solver at the end here, which is just referencing other channels. This is where you affect the particle simulation. So we have like a minimum lifespan, so how long the bubble, the whitewater particles are going to live once they've been emitted, the minimum time they will live, and a maximum, and obviously a variance, and also spray. Spray is similar to to foam, but it behaves more like a spray, so it's going to have much more kind of volume. Sorry, not volume. It's going to have more appearance of greater velocity to it. And then bubbles, and bubbles is what creates our foam. And so let's have a look, and we will. So on our whitewater, we're going to just change the maximum lifespan to 10. Okay, and I'm going to turn off spray and write out our foam with the bubbles. So from here, if we go up to object level, go back into our import, and then we have this attribute wrangle, and this is basically just controlling the p scale of each particle, and also the velocity is just timesing it by 1. So we want to write out the simulation after this point. So let's drop in a ROP output driver again, and this is going to be called foam. So we'll change the name of the node to ROP_foam geo$os, and we'll render out the frame range. And so I would do this with the foam. I would simulate the foam on its own, and then I would write that out, and then I'd hop back into the solver and I would turn off the foam, and I would enable spray, and I'd turn off bubbles, and I'd write them out separately. This partially is, well, because you can then splitting up each element is good, because if something gets lost or whatever, you don't need to re-simulate the whole thing. You can just re-simulate the part that is corrupted or lost or whatever, and you can only have things on disk which are absolutely necessary, and you can then render each element separately. So you would write out the whitewater elements separately. So that was a quick introduction to flip simulations, and just generally how you could get started on doing your own kind of basic flip simulations. And a lot of the look of fluids is, it's how you have a lot of artistic control over the look of the fluids. And so playing with these parameters, obviously that would take far too long to go through all of them. There's so much to flip simulations to go through in an hour, but hopefully this has given you an idea of a basic workflow of generating a flip simulation, caching that out to disk, caching the surface or the mesh out to disk, and generating good collision geometry, and then also from your base particle fit simulation generating whitewater secondary elements. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and thanks for joining me.